It did not prove despair or joy, danger or safety. It simply revealed a heart caught between possibility and fear, between longing and caution. "Did she ever talk to you about wanting to leave?" he asked Elise. "She talked about wanting to feel seen," Elise answered slowly. "Not admired or praised, just seen as she was, not as people needed her to be." "Did she ever mention someone in particular?" Elise hesitated, brows drawing together in thought. "She mentioned a friend who came by after evening choir, someone she could speak freely with. She never said much more than that. She seemed lighter when she spoke of them, but also careful." "A man, a woman?" "I always assumed it was a man," Elise said. "But that might have been my own habit of thinking. She never said." Again, nothing conclusive. No single statement that pointed toward a definitive story. Yet as Jonah moved from person to a former choir member who remembered seeing Maribel in hushed conversation near the church steps, to an older deacon who recalled a kind smile hiding an unspoken weight, he began to sense something forming beneath the surface. It was not a map of events. It was an emotional pattern, a woman standing at a quiet crossroads in her life, reaching out for connection in ways that did not fit neatly into the town's expectations. People remembered her kindness, her patience, her attentive gaze when others spoke. But threaded through those memories was a recurring detail, the sense that she often listened more than she spoke about herself, as if guarding something fragile. The more Jonah listened, the more he became aware of his own reflection in the case. He had spent his life in a similar posture, observing, taking in, rarely offering his own inner world in return. He wondered, not for the first time, whether his need to understand others had always been, in part, a way to avoid facing himself. At night he lay awake, replaying voices in his mind. Daniel's hesitant recollection, Elise's careful recoloring of her cousin's life, the priest's remembered pauses. None of them formed a straight line toward certainty. Each added another shade to a portrait painted in uncertainties and delicate contradictions. The young officers wanted updates. "Anything solid yet?" they asked. "Not solid," Jonah answered, "but real." They did not quite know what to do with that. He knew, however, that the path forward, if it could be called that, would not be built from fingerprints, fibers, or reconstructed timelines. It would emerge from the fragile terrain of hearts that had once intersected with Maribel's, and then moved on, leaving behind impressions they had never fully examined. He was not chasing proof. He was pursuing understanding. And in that pursuit, he could already feel something shifting, not toward resolution, but toward a deeper, more complicated kind of doubt. The more Jonah listened, the more he noticed how memories shifted when the topic of companionship arose. Not accusations, not even clear discomfort, just soft changes in expression, a glance to the side, the kind of pause that suggested more lived beneath the surface. What had once appeared as simple connections now seemed threaded with delicate strands of hesitation. Maribel had lived a quiet life, yet 3 people seemed woven more tightly into her final months than the town had ever acknowledged. None of them appeared harmful in any way. Rather, each carried a different shade of tenderness, longing, or unspoken expectation. It was these softened edges that created tension, not conflict. The first was Jonah's Lafleur, a fellow teacher at the parish school. People remembered his gentleness, the way he helped children fix torn book pages or wiped chalk dust from their hands. When Jonah visited him, now older, sitting beneath a pecan tree with a blanket over his knees, he spoke of Maribel with a calm smile that flickered around the edges. "She cared about truth," Jonah said quietly. "Not the big truths, the small ones. like how a child feels when their name isn't heard clearly, or how silence can weigh differently depending on who is sitting beside you. "And you," Jonah asked softly, "did you sit beside her often?" Jonah's hesitated, fingers smoothing the fabric of the blanket. "We shared long pauses," he said, "but I never understood if they brought her comfort or pressure. That uncertainty stayed with me." A subtle feeling lingered, not wrongdoing, but the sense of someone who might have hoped for connection and never found clarity. Not a threat, only a quiet ache. The second person was Clara Dupre, a choir singer with a lyrical speaking voice. She remembered walking home with Maribel after evening rehearsals, talking about books, music, and fears neither of them could name aloud. When Jonah mentioned the timeline of those fall evenings in 1973, Clara's gaze drifted toward the window. "She seemed drawn to someone," Clara said gently. "Not romantically, at least I don't think so. It was more like finding a mirror in a person, a moment where you see yourself reflected in ways that feel unfamiliar." "Did you ever ask her who it was?" Jonah asked. Clara shook her head. "She guarded that part of her heart. I didn't want to intrude." Her voice held warmth, but also something quieter, the subtle tension of someone who had known a fragile truth, sensed its weight, and stepped back rather than risk altering it. The third person was Reverend Thibodeaux, who had guided Maribel through years of thoughtful conversations. Jonah visited him in the rectory garden, where roses and jasmine climbed toward afternoon light. The Reverend listened to Jonah's questions with an expression touched by time. "There was someone she spoke of in broad strokes," he said. "Someone whose presence stirred something delicate within her. Not fear, more like hesitation mixed with hope. She sought clarity, yet also seemed reluctant to receive it." "Do you believe that person shaped her final days?" Another thoughtful pause. "I believe we are all shaped by longing," he said, "and by the places inside us we do not yet know how to share." Jonah felt no suspicion toward any of them. Instead, he sensed emotional crossroads, the intersections where unspoken feelings and incomplete understanding brushed against each other. These were not dangerous relationships. They were simply human ones, with the tenderness and uncertainty that come when hearts attempt to navigate closeness. The tension did not arise from threat or harm, but from the quiet truth that every person Maribel touched seemed to carry a small, unresolved version of her. And as Jonah listened, he began to understand that emotional complexity, not intention, had shaped the shadows around her final steps. Nothing pointed toward a clear answer. Everything pointed toward why answers had been so hard to find. 5. Old secrets unfold, revealing betrayal and hidden personal motives. When Elise returned with a second box, smaller, older, its edges softened by years, Jonah sensed immediately that the story was preparing to shift. She set it carefully on the table as if offering something fragile, not because of its contents, but because of the weight it held for her. "These weren't letters," Elise said quietly. "These were things she kept tucked away. I didn't understand them then." Inside lay a mix of small objects: a pressed magnolia petal wrapped in thin paper, a ribbon embroidered with faded initials, and a few journal pages written in Maribel's looping script, torn from a notebook. Not secrets meant to be hidden, more like fragments of who she had been when no one else was watching. One page drew Jonah's attention. It described a conversation Maribel had overheard outside the church, two voices in low tones discussing a decision someone regretted, something involving trust and timing. The writing did not accuse. It simply recorded the feeling the moment gave her, a sense of standing beside a truth not meant for her. Another page spoke of disappointment. I believed kindness would be enough to steady things, but sometimes kindness creates expectations we never meant to promise. Jonah read the line again. It hinted at a misunderstanding, perhaps even a subtle betrayal of the heart, not dramatic, not harmful, simply human. Elise pointed to the ribbon with embroidered initials. She made that for someone, she said, but she never said who. When she didn't give it away, I think it hurt her more than she ever admitted. Old longing, private missteps, moments where affection and uncertainty blurred. But there was one final fragment, a note written in another hand, folded into an envelope that bore no name. Its words were gentle, careful, and carried the tone of someone who wished to be both near and distant. You deserve more clarity than I can offer. I respect you too much to pretend otherwise. Please forgive the hesitation. It's not you, it's the part of myself I have not yet learned to explain. Jonah sat with the note for a long moment, letting its hesitation settle. This was not deception, not cruelty. It was someone trying to step back with care, yet leaving behind an emotional ripple. "Do you know who wrote it?" he asked. Elise shook her head. No one ever said. Jonah realized then that the deeper thread was not betrayal in the usual sense. It was the quiet ache created when two people hoped for different things and discovered the truth too late. Maribel had not hidden dangerous secrets. She had hidden tender ones. The kind people protect to avoid causing pain, even when they carry a quiet cost. And as Jonah pieced together these fragments, he understood that the case was becoming less about a single event and more about the emotional landscape surrounding it. A landscape full of fragile hopes, gentle disappointments, and choices shaped by unspoken feelings. Each secret made the final night feel both clearer and more clouded, as if every answer opened two new doors. 6. Twist exposes the innocent as deeply conflicted and quietly harmful. It was not a dramatic revelation, but a subtle shift. The moment when Jonah began to recognize a familiar tone beneath multiple testimonies. A softness in the way people described a certain presence. A warmth mixed with avoidance. A person who appeared in memories like a comforting shadow. At first, he had dismissed the pattern. It seemed too gentle, too understated to hold significance. Yet as he revisited conversations, the same names surfaced with the same careful phrasing. Reverend Thibodeaux. Not in accusation. Not in blame. But in the quiet way people spoke of someone who offered solace, while staying just distant enough that no one ever fully understood where his emotions lived. Jonah returned to the rectory garden. The Reverend greeted him with his usual calm, tending to a blooming rose. But when Jonah mentioned the letter, the gentle, hesitant apology, something flickered across the Reverend's expression. A pause, a slight tightening around the eyes. "It was your handwriting," Jonah said, not accusing, only observing. The Reverend exhaled slowly. "I cared for her," he said, his voice soft, "more than I allowed myself to admit at the time." "Did she know?" "She sensed it, I believe, which is why I stepped back. I didn't want to influence her thoughts or create confusion. My role was guidance, not closeness." His words were earnest, but within them lay the twist that reshaped the entire journey. He had stepped back with good intentions, yet the distance created an emotional void that Maribel interpreted as uncertainty, perhaps even quiet hurt. The Reverend had not acted out of malice or secrecy. He had acted out of inner conflict, unable to reconcile his feelings with his responsibilities. "Did you meet her by the water?" Jonah asked. A soft breath, a longer pause. "I spoke with her earlier that evening," he said gently. "Not at the water, at the church steps. She seemed contemplative but not distressed. We exchanged a few words about direction, about choices. I encouraged her to trust her own clarity. And after that, I walked home alone. His tone held sincerity, yet Jonah sensed the deeper truth. The Reverend had been the emotional fulcrum of Maribel's final months. His gentle uncertainty, his respectful distance, had subtly shaped her internal world. He had not caused harm intentionally, yet his presence, warm, conflicted, hesitant, had guided her more deeply than he realized. He had been the innocent, the calm, trusted figure no one questioned. Yet his mixed signals, his unspoken feelings, had influenced the course of events in quiet, complicated ways. Not wrongdoing, not guilt, just the intricate ripple effect of human contradiction, where kindness and caution intertwine until clarity slips away. Jonah left the garden with the realization that the truth was not about assigning blame. It was about acknowledging the delicate impacts of hearts that cross paths at the wrong moments, carrying intentions that do not align with the outcomes they create. 7. Concludes with open-ended moral tone, hiding truth saves someone. Jonah stood again near the water's edge, not as the young deputy who once trembled with uncertainty, but as an older man who understood that truth often lived in layered forms. The bayou carried the same quiet grace it always had, reflecting dusk in soft ripples. He held the case file, worn, reshaped by decades, filled with tender contradictions. He had gathered more understanding than he ever expected, but none of it pointed toward a single, conclusive moment. Maribel's life had not ended through clear choice or clear influence. Instead, it seemed to rest on the fragile intersection of longing, hesitation, and mixed emotions. She had stood between possibilities, shaped by connections that cared for her yet left her uncertain. And the Reverend, gentle, conflicted, quietly influential, had carried his own burden of unsaid truths. To reveal the full emotional story now would reopen wounds he had spent a lifetime tending with grace. His actions had been sincere, his struggle real. Exposing the depth of his involvement would not offer clarity. It would only shift uncertainty onto someone who had meant well. Jonah realized that telling the full truth would not bring comfort, nor would it bring justice. It would only redistribute the weight of doubt. He closed the file softly. Some truths, he understood now, were not meant to be presented as answers. Some lived best in quiet understanding, where compassion softened the sharper edges of memory. He walked away from the water knowing he would not write everything into the final report, not because he wished to conceal wrongdoing, but because revealing the emotional labyrinth would harm a man who had already carried years of introspection, and because the town and Maribel's memory deserved gentleness rather than certainty. In the end, the cold case would close not with a declaration, but with a quiet acknowledgement. The truth existed, but closure did not. And perhaps that was its own form of peace, a fragile, uneasy peace that lingered like the bayou's stillness at dusk, where reflections tremble without ever fully settling.